This is the Teacher Talking Time podcast.
Everyone, welcome to another episode of the Teacher Talking Time podcast. I'm going to be hosting this one with Andrew, and we have the illustrious presence of Katarina here with us, who is going to be talking about this book that she has co-authored with Zoltán Dörnyei. And before we jump right into the book, I just wanted to say, first and foremost, welcome to our show, Katarina. It's a great honor to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's so lovely to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Exactly. So I kind of wanted to start with how I actually came across your profile and the book, because I had no idea that there was such book being written. I remember I was actually on Twitter, and of course on Twitter people are constantly complaining or bickering, and then I remember someone retweeting you mentioning the publication of this book, and I remember reading the title of that book and being immediately drawn to it, because I, very much like Andrew and Mike, we're very, very, very much into language learning and teaching, and this is basically what we do with Learn Your English. We're really trying to help teachers teach better lessons or become better teachers, but also help them inspire their students to become better language learners. So before we dive right into the book, the process of writing it, and talking about these stories of these exceptional learners, perhaps we could start by talking a little bit about you, like your background. How did you get into language education, your interests when it comes to language learning and teaching?
Right. Big question. So I guess to start from the very beginning. So I grew up in Texas, but my mom is Indian and born in Uganda, but then moved to the UK. And then my dad was Greek and moved to the UK as well for university, and then somehow, and they both ended up in Texas and had me. And so growing up, as you can imagine, I had a very different background from a lot of the people around me. And I did grow up in quite a diverse suburb, but not quite that mixed of a background. And so there was this question always of where are you from sort of thing. And so that made me that, and I think also my parents' kind of celebration of all the different places that we were from fostered in me a very strong idea of, well, what is out there in the world, curiosity for different cultures and different languages. And so growing up, I always wanted to learn as many possible different languages, to the point where I actually went to a math and science focused high school because they were the only school that would allow me to take two languages at the same time, which was a lot of suffering in hindsight. But and so then when I went to university, I studied linguistics, and the kind of linguistics that I studied there was more theoretical. And so at that point, I thought, okay, well, I went into this degree thinking that I really wanted to learn about how people learn languages. And instead of that, I learned about language itself. So then I decided to kind of take a step back, and I moved to Japan to go and teach English for a couple of years. And so then following that experience, I thought, well, actually, this is something that I'm really passionate about. And because I had taught English, and I didn't feel very effective as a teacher. So I thought, well, there must be a better way of doing this. Like, why don't I look at more of this sort of research that's going on, to see how I can become better. And that sort of has led me down a chain of studies to a PhD now. So
congratulations. Yeah. I kind of want to circle back now to a couple of things that you've mentioned. I think the first one is, so you didn't really want to become a teacher. I think this is something that Andrew and I really talk a lot about, is that we don't know a lot of people say, like, I was born a teacher, I really wanted to do this. You kind of like stumbled upon teaching, right? Was it something that you knew you wanted to do?
I think I've always liked teaching in terms of kind of the mentoring aspect of teaching. But you're right in that I did just kind of stumble upon teaching itself. It's interesting because the program that I went on is JET, which is Japan Exchange and Teaching Program.
Right.
And the thing that I like about the name there is because it is very much about exchange. And I think that teaching is an exchange, right? It's an exchange of knowledge, of, identities, of many different things. And so in a way, it's always something, the exchange of information. I mean, at one point I wanted to go into publishing, which is also about exchange. So, it's not that I always wanted to be a teacher or anything, but it also it wasn't strange to end up there.
Huh. And you also mentioned that you didn't feel like you were very effective as a teacher. And I'm wondering how did you develop the self-awareness to actually think to yourself, maybe I'm not doing that great of a job. Maybe there's something else that I could do to be better, because not every teacher is like that. I'm not saying that most teachers are not like that, but some teachers are very resistant to the idea of evolving and improving and kind of like fine-tuning their teaching chops. What was this? Maybe you can help us understand, what was the moment when you realized, you know what, I need to learn more. I need to go back and really study and perhaps become, as you said, a more effective teacher. What was that moment like for you?
I think it was from the very beginning, because with the JET program, you're actually hired on as an assistant language teacher. And so theoretically, you should be an assistant in the classroom. And I did a degree, my bachelor's in linguistics, not in teacher training or anything like that. And so I wasn't a trained teacher, but because the department that I was placed in was just they were very overburdened. And so when I kind of came into the department and they gave me, a little bit of like, okay, well, here you can plan some activities or plan some like half of lessons and things. And when they found that whatever I was doing was working, they're like, okay, well, you can just have the whole lesson. Or then the next semester, they were like, okay, well, you can design your own course, have at it, And so from the very beginning, I was very much like, I don't know how to do this. I haven't been trained. I'm not qualified for this. And they were always in the classroom, right? Making sure that I wasn't just off on my own doing some crazy whatever. But yeah, from the very beginning, it just felt like, okay, I need to be better for these students because they deserve better, right? Because I think also because I've had my fair share of bad language teachers. And so being very picky about them myself, I always kind of think back, and because I'm also always still learning different languages, I always think, well, if I had me as a teacher, would I be happy with my teaching?
That's a good question. It's a very good reflective question there.
I'm curious, and we're gonna be here forever now because there's so much in there. What what criteria, when you said that you had teachers that you were not your favorite or you didn't like or whatever, what would you care to share criteria that formed that opinion?
I mean, I think there's like so many different archetypes in my head of all the really terrible, there's so many. But so one is someone who just simply doesn't speak the language and was hired on for some other job and then somehow got shoehorned in. So, they just barely studied it, or, they wouldn't be able to hold a conversation in it, which I think is such a tragedy. It shouldn't ever happen.
That's unfair for everybody.
Yeah, exactly. But then in terms of like actual teaching styles and things, I had one teacher who she had these PowerPoints where she would just have a sentence in the language and then be like, okay, so someone translate this into, she had it in English and she's like, okay, someone translate this into English or into Japanese or whatever, and vice versa. And then she would just wait for someone in the classroom to do it. And there's only 4 of us and we're all not going to do, no matter how motivated you are as a student, if you don't have, because I think she also didn't build that mutual respect in the classroom. She was constantly kind of putting down her students, being like, oh, you guys are going out, over the weekend, so I bet you didn't do any work or something, even though you may have done the work. And so then to put us on the spot where we would have to volunteer to do that, it's a bit of a no-brainer,
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's funny you say that because I mean, we're gonna get to the book. I actually don't want to jump right into the book because I feel like we're gonna talk so much about the book, but um, I want to understand more the impetus, like why focus on writing a book based on stories of these so-called gifted adult language learners who, and I love how you describe them in the book, and I'm going to read a verbatim here, against all odds, right? And these people achieve this so-called native-like proficiency, which we will also dissect later. But what was the main impetus to actually write this book? Was there any sort of connection to your language learning experience, to your language teaching experience, or was it more like part of your PhD or something like that?
Um, well, I think in terms of with my own language learning experience, a little bit is you kind of ask yourself the question whenever you start something new is what's the goal, right? What is the end point? Or if there isn't an end point, what is the moving goalpost? Where do you put it? And with language, I think that's a really difficult thing to do because, you know, you don't have, say, oh, I want to play, if you're a basketball player, I want to play in the NBA. What's the NBA of language learning? And so that is kind of what drew me to the project. But the idea actually came from Zoltán's class because he was teaching about the critical period hypothesis, which is this idea that there is a period for every human during which we are naturally capable of learning languages by osmosis. And after that certain cutoff age, we wouldn't be able to do that, and language learning becomes difficult. And there's a lot of different variations of this hypothesis, and a lot of debate over what age it's at, or whether it's a strict cutoff or a linear sort of thing. But so he was teaching about this, and then he said, but some people are may be able to actually still learn a language as if they were, or to the point where you wouldn't be able to tell that they weren't a native speaker, despite having been after that supposed critical period hypothesis. So we put it at after the age of 18, but usually critical periods usually
18?
around like so we set it at 18, but usually critical periods around like puberty.
Yeah, I was gonna say
but it
that
ranges
12,
from like
right?
8 to 13.
Yeah. Huh. Interesting.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
interesting. So I think my question, I mean, I wasn't thinking about talking about the critical period hypothesis, or I think I remember when I read about it a long time ago, they call it the sensitive period, right?
Yeah.
Where there's this ideal, as you said, this ideal time window of brain development to acquire a language. But I think I think my question then becomes, maybe you can help us understand what are some of the variables that you, Zoltán, and everyone else involved in this project, what were some of the variables that you found within the critical period? If you can actually share some of those things with us.
What do you mean by so we didn't actually talk to anyone within the critical period.
Right.
Because
right. They're all
so the
adults,
people
yes.
so the people that we talked to were over the age of
Right.
were past the critical period, basically. So yeah, I mean, I know that previous studies that kind of look at proving or disproving the critical period look at variables like age at which they start
Right.
learning or in which they're immersed in the environment, the different kinds of domains that you would use the language in, things like that. But yeah, we didn't look at those things.
So basically the book then is trying to somewhat debunk the critical period hypothesis. Is that correct?
Not at all. So we are completely just sidestepping the issue because so there's been this huge body of research that has been either trying to prove or disprove the critical period hypothesis by putting a bunch of monolinguals and bilinguals or multilinguals in lab settings and have them do various tasks and measuring them to the millisecond. And if they can find no differences, then that means there's no critical period. And if they can find differences, that means there is one. But there exists within these participants, you have these people who they're recruited somehow, right? And sometimes the criteria is that you have to be able to pass as a native speaker for a certain period of time. And so then the question for us is, okay, we don't actually care for our purposes whether or not you can be indistinguishable by the millisecond from a native speaker. What we care about is that you passed in the first place at all, because for most people, that's not really something that is achievable, right?
Yeah, I definitely want to dissect this pass, because I think I remember that being a very recurrent theme in the book. And as I was reading and going through all the chapters, I remember reading that a lot. And I was like, oh, I really want to talk more about that. But before we just jump right into the book, you also make a very, very good distinction, which I think would be very useful for people who are listening and watching this podcast, a very useful distinction between polyglots and those people who master a language to a native-like or a near-native-like proficiency. Can you help us understand the difference between the two?
Yes. So if we think about exception, so let's start with kind of the word exception, right? Because exceptionality or giftedness, we chose exceptionality specifically because it means that it's the exception to the rule. So most people would not be able or would not achieve this for whatever reason. And so there's two different ways to be exceptional in language learning. The first is to become a polyglot. So polyglots maximize the number of languages that you speak. So, usually I think it's 6 or more. So you would speak 6 or more languages.
Wow.
To a decent level. Where you want to put that cutoff is debatable depending on a lot of things. And you have a lot of YouTubers that are out there being like, oh yes, I'm a polyglot, and then they butcher 3 out of 6 languages, and everyone in the comments is like, that wasn't even a word in French or something.
Exactly.
But then you do have real polyglots as well that do exist. And so then the other kind of exceptionality would be maximizing the depth of one language. So where polyglots maximize breadth, native-like language learners would then maximize depth. So they are an expert in one language. Usually one. Sometimes you can be in 2 or more, but I think the kind of effort and time that it would take to do one usually means that it's only one.
So basically breadth over depth. That's the main difference between someone who masters language to a near-native-like proficiency versus a polyglot. And it's interesting that you said that, because I remember reading that in the book, and I find that a lot of polyglots don't actually speak all these languages. They might master maybe one with a certain level of depth, but the other ones are like, they can say a few things, they can have very basic conversations, but they haven't really reached this this depth in the language as you suggested. So I think my question then becomes, how do you measure depth within a person, one of those gifted adults that you mentioned in the book? How do you measure the depth in a language?
Right. So that's a good question, because how do you measure proficiency, right? And what does proficiency mean?
Oh,
because
yes.
We
Big
have all
question.
these different tests and all these different frameworks to compare against. And so, a lot of the times I think here in Europe, you have the CEFR, Common European Framework.
Yeah, the CEFR. Yeah.
And so, but for us, what mattered was kind of this phenomenon of passing, right? Because, someone could have a really, really someone could have like a very broad understanding and use of a language. So I think Zoltán always used to use himself as an example, because his command of the language arguably is unquestionable, right? I mean, he's written God knows how many books in academic research articles and everything. And he lived here, had his family here and everything. So there isn't any situation in which he couldn't function without problem, right, in English. But at the same time, no one would ever take him as a native speaker for various reasons. And so then us, we're not necessarily saying that being native-like is the highest level of proficiency, because you could be native-like in different domains.
Okay.
Right? So like some of our participants who were native-like in English may not have had the command of English that Zoltán has, for example, right?
Yes.
But they have achieved this other thing, which is being native-like, which is not necessarily achievable for a lot of people.
Right.
Because it does have to do with things like pronunciation,
right.
As well as you know, collocations, or you know, different sayings, turns of speech,
right.
even the way that you kind of just gestures and interact with people.
Right. I think, well, I mean, there's so much to unpack there, right there. And I remember, I think you guys wrote about that in the book, where I think Zoltán considered himself a high functioning non-native speaker of English. Is that a good term that we can use to describe someone, as opposed, because I feel like, and Andrew's probably gonna chime in at some point, I feel like the biggest problem that we have in our field now is perhaps the commodification of English language teaching, but much more so this idea of trying to push or sell this non-native like or native like proficiency, because even the term sound like a native speaker, you may sound like one, but you're never going to be one. So maybe you can help us.
Well, the other question is when you say that you want to sound like a native speaker, which native speaker, right? Do you want to sound like I don't know, a 5-year-old native speaker? Yeah. Do you want to sound like a Texan? Do you want to sound like, I don't know, Boris Johnson? Or, you know, what does this mean? Do you want to sound like an academic? Do you want to sound like a rapper? You know what, there's so many different ideas of what native is. And so, yeah, there's this huge problem. I think also because language learners want an idea of, okay, I've reached this level now, right? And, you know, when teachers are always given these kinds of frameworks of, okay, you have to get your students to this level or to that level, right? And we have tests for these and things. And so then when you have this idea of, you know, a lot of students come in and say, oh, I want to sound like a native speaker. And suddenly teachers have to say, okay, well, that's problematic for a lot of different reasons. Right. What do we do with that, right? And so I think one thing that was really important for us with this book was sort of starting out at the beginning saying, look, being a native, we're not saying that being a native speaker is the goal for everyone, or being like a native speaker, being native like is the goal for everyone. And there are a broad variety of different goals for any language learner. You know, you may want to learn, you may want to work in that language, you may want to raise a family in that language, you may want to move to the country that speaks that language, or you may just want to read books for fun. You know, you could have any manner of different goals. And so sounding like a native speaker is a goal, but it is and should not be the only goal. And it definitely shouldn't be one that is institutionalized, because it's so arbitrary, right? Like, what is the native speaker? How do we define this? There's so many different gray areas there that it's a very non-functional target for standardization.
I feel like, and I don't know if you're going to agree with me, I feel like, because you mentioned this in the book, that a lot of language learners, even though they have this I mean, myself included, we all have this initial motivation when we're starting some sort of new journey. And in this case, to reach this proficiency, this native-like proficiency. I usually tell my students that, like, when you're going to start, when you go to the gym, is your goal to, like, I want to have a very well-defined six-pack? How often do people actually achieve that? So I tell them that reaching native-like proficiency is, as you said, the NBA of language learning before. I would say that native-like proficiency is the six-pack of gym workout routines, you know? So I think, and yeah, I think you kind of talked about this, Katarina, but what would be, like, how can a learner, I guess, or a language learner, or even a teacher help students come up with more feasible goals for people who are actually starting their learning journey? What would that look like? And what did this look like for the people that you the stories of the people that you've had for this book?
Right. I think so when we go to the gym, right, and we want that six pack, we also set kind of proximal goals for ourselves
Right.
as well. We say, okay, well, this week I want to lift this much, right? And, in a month's time, I want to be able to lift that much. And at the end of that journey, maybe there's that six pack. And if you don't end up, if your goals change along the way and you no longer want a six pack, but instead you want to deadlift 2 horses, that's wonderful. And that's okay. So I think having this idea that goals are flexible, but also I think setting up proximal goals, right?
Mhm.
Because it's knowing that you're on your way to a goal that I think is the energizing thing. So I would like to say that a lot of our participants did not actually aim to be native-like. And it
Interesting.
happened kind of on the way. And this is like kind of very clearly outlined in the second book, in stories, because everyone had like a very different trajectory towards there. And so some people did use very proximal goals, and some people just kind of focused on what was important for them at the time.
That's
So for
fascinating.
example, yeah.
I didn't know that. I didn't know. I actually thought that they were all trying to achieve native-like proficiency, the six-pack of language. So they
Yeah.
weren't. Very
No,
interesting.
not at all. So some of them, so for example, Teresa, I think, is the first one that comes to mind, who just doesn't pay any attention to kind of accents or to any kinds of sort of formal models of proficiency, but rather just kind of moved here and was like, okay, we'll just go with the flow and live my life here and see what happens. And language just happened by, I think the word she uses, by osmosis.
Right.
And so, for some people it does come naturally, whereas for other people, they really had to work at it. So there's Marianne, for example, who she worked in a hospital in the UK and was learning English. She's originally Dutch, and she wanted to do everything in her power to kind of fit in with her community and make sure that her life here worked out smoothly. And so then her profession actually ended up giving her different kind of barriers to overcome, not barriers, I guess hurdles to overcome, that she kind of had to rise to the occasion to meet. And so those acted as proximal goals for her in her ultimate kind of goal of doing the best she could for her language proficiency.
Very interesting. I honestly didn't know that. Andrew, go. Sorry.
I really like that example a lot. And when you said being native-like in different domains, I spent like 10 minutes just throwing that around in my brain. And it's really, really interesting because that NBA example or the six pack, that's not beer because that would be my case. I would definitely get a six pack, but it would necessarily be physical. Players or kids, if you ask them who want to be basketball players, you're right. They would probably, I want to play in the NBA, right? But that's not a finite, as you said, it's not, you have people, you have Michael Jordan and you have LeBron James, who are historically, if you could mold in a lab a basketball player, those are the gold standards, and they are good, or they are exceptional, to use your word, at everything, at shooting, at passing, at dribbling, at defense, at rebounding, everything that you would want. But then there are 99.9% of NBA players who are not them, who are also in the NBA. And maybe they excel at shooting and they're terrible at defense. Or maybe they excel at defense and they're terrible at everything else. Or maybe they never get to play. They're Rudy, right? Right?
Good point. Yeah.
But if you ask them what they do for a living, they say, I'm in the NBA.
And
So
in
that
order to get there, they did have to, be a good player compared to normal people.
So is your reflective question of what is the NBA of language learning is it, can you excel at rebounding and nothing else? So can you excel at conversation skills and nothing else and be in that native like domain for that one specific thing? Can you excel at writing work emails because that's the only thing you care about and not excel at other things? Or is it a bit more complicated than that?
I think it would be more complicated than excelling at work emails, for example, because
Okay.
that is giving you, in order to do that, you have to have a good understanding of, a lot of politeness, also very like locational politeness, because
Mm-hmm.
work emails in the UK are very different than in the US, as I have found out. Um, so, and then, writing skills and, register and all things like that. So, but on the other hand, I think there are a lot of different skills where you can be really good at, and kind of let other ones fall behind. So I think one that was more common for our participants was that most of them were much better at speaking, because I think our criteria was that you had to be able to pass in a conversation, so in a speaking task.
Okay.
That, not that we set one, but in speaking. So a lot of them actually did cite not necessarily feeling as comfortable in their writing skills. And I think Uwe, for example, actually talks about this a lot, where he actually achieved spoken native likeness quite early on, and he didn't necessarily count this as an achievement because it was something that just happened alongside his
Interesting.
interest in the sounds of English. But then later in his career, he actually had to work very hard at his writing proficiency, his academic writing, and he counts that as his achievement, because that was something that he actively tried
Interesting.
to mold in
Yeah.
a certain way.
Okay.
Oh, wow.
And with native like proficiency, the like in that sentence means that the person is not, right? So when we talk about models and sounding like, when sounding like means speaking. When I speak, I sound like, but it could be, should be, reading
Right, like.
or write like or whatever. We interviewed, I want to say it was last year, but it might have been 2 years ago. We talked to Dr. Masatoshi Sato,
Oh, yes.
and you asked Katarina the $1 million question, like, well, which native speaker do you want to sound like? Rhetorically, obviously, because there isn't one and doesn't exist. But he argued for students finding a model to sound like, to write like, to read like, etc., who shares their L1, who is the native like, or has an exceptional toolbox, for lack of a better term, that they aspire to have. So they want to get to the NBA, but what kind of player do they want to be? Do they want to be the star, or do they want to be a role player, or do they want to be a bench player, or sixth man of the year, or whatever? Is that something that we can add here? So don't find a native model, but find an actual person who shares your language, who you then can learn from, model, watch their talks, listen to them, read their articles, etc., etc.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that can be really productive, right? Because you then, not only do you have a model for success, but you also have someone to potentially copy in certain ways. And I think, for example, so Sarah, one of our participants, talks about role models a lot, because she said specifically that she did actually pick role models who are other language learners themselves, because I think there's like a specific quotation from her where she says that she wanted to be like her classmate who was learning Hungarian, because she didn't want to be like her teacher, because her teacher was too far away and was I think a native Hungarian speaker, but she wanted to be like her classmate because she could envision that better. And sometimes visions can be really energizing for motivation.
Yeah, we were going to ask you about the whole L2 self, because this is something that Zoltán also had written extensively about. Like, how many of these exceptional language learners actually had a very clear, vivid vision of themselves in the second language? How many of them were actually going through that process of visualizing themselves in that language?
Off the top of my head, I couldn't give you the number. So it wasn't everyone.
Okay.
And so, but I think one that comes to mind is Peng, who talks about how vision was so powerful for him, and it really reigned over all of his kind of energies in learning English, and how he's finding that now he's learning, I think, French, and he's found that he doesn't want to have that vision because in a way the vision was too powerful. It like really reigned over his entire life for a very long time. And so now he's like, well, I have like smaller goals for French. I think he just wants to read literature. And so he's like, yeah, so his approach is different, which is interesting. And then some people, I think Amelia said that, she's read about kind of the vision and the L2 MSS and everything, and it's just not how her motivation worked. She just, I think she just wanted to do what was there and be better and continue to improve. So I think for some people it can be really, really helpful, and it can be really, really powerful. And for some people it's not, and I think that's okay. I think you just have to find kind of what helps your motivation.
Yeah, what's that driving force for you? Interesting. Well, let's dive into the book now, because we've been talking about the book the whole time. But I wanted, first of all, the title of the book, Stories from Exceptional Language Learners Who Have Achieved Native-like Proficiency. I guess the title says it all. But one thing I'm really interested in is your writing process. I'm very interested in like how people are able to compartmentalize thoughts, ideas. So I would love to speak or to hear you speak more about your writing process. What does that look like for you? What did your writing sessions look like? Did you start with an empty page, and then you were like staring at that empty page for like hours, like I do sometimes? So what was it like for you?
For me personally, I would just, first disclaimer, writing is a really painful thing. I sit there from the morning until the evening doing staring at my computer, doing absolutely nothing, getting nothing done, and just feeling terrible about myself the entire time. And then around like 11 p.m., my brain is like, okay, well, I said I wasn't going to go to bed until I get this done. And then it all just comes out in like 3 hours, which is so frustrating. But it is what it is. But no, so we didn't really start with a blank page here. The nice thing, I think, about the whole qualitative research process is that, we had the interviews, and then the way that we had condensed the interviews and the way that we analyzed them and things like that meant that, in a way, for the book, we actually had an outline from our analysis anyway. And so, going back to that in vivo file and Word was a very fluid thing. But we did sit down. It was me, Zoltán, and Capucine, and we sat down, and we said, okay, and bringing to the meeting, we decided, okay, everyone bring to the meeting a table of contents and kind of what you think should go in each of those sections. And then we sat there kind of negotiating, like, okay, well, this is similar, this is not, and, throwing bits out or adding bits here, to make kind of a coherent story. And then, yeah, when it came to actually writing, it was nice because you actually had, all of these different quotations and sort of the topics that emerged that you wanted to cover. And the quotations kind of led you there. And as for the stories, that was a lot easier, actually, because you have the content there. You just have to put it in order of what we call a story in the West, I guess, in like chronological order.
Right. And I think there are 30 stories in the book. Is that correct?
Yes.
30 learners for the book. What was the selection process? What was that like? How did you guys decide, you know what, we're going to have this person, but we're not going to have these people? Like, tell us more about that.
Right. So we used what we call the duck test. So
Oh
the
yes,
duck
that's
test is,
the beginning of the book. Yes, I remember
yeah.
now.
So if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it is a duck. So basically they had, yeah, easy. um, so
Sure,
the idea
sure.
is that, well, I mean, for our purposes, it was a duck, right? Because so basically, the people that we took were people who could recount passing as a native speaker in their target language um, consistently
Hmm.
for at least 5 minutes, let's say,
Hmm.
right? And not just one time. So it can't be, oh, you were at your cousin's wedding and his mom said, oh, wow, like, where are you from in Greece? And actually you were from Hungary.
Hmm.
You know, it has to be consistently by many different people, right? And so if there are any kind of doubts with that, then we said, okay, no, like, if you can only really recount like 2 or 3 times, maybe you're not what we're looking for, even though that's great for you, you know.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then our other criteria was that they could not have spent an extended period of time immersed in the target language before the age of 18. So that's taking out our critical period
Right.
hypothesis.
Hmm.
And they can't have had any heritage links.
Oh.
So
Fascinating.
also related to the critical period hypothesis. So just making sure that they're not having any kind of early exposure in those traditional ways.
Leo, are you a duck?
I think so.
I think so.
I think so. I think I'm a duck. Yeah. But not, I think the critical period got a little bit into me because
Okay.
I started when I was maybe 9, 10. I started at age 6 or 7 with like listening to the BBC, but I didn't understand much of what was said. But I found ways to stay in touch with the language, but I would say that most of my learning was incidental, wasn't really intentional. It was mostly consuming. So maybe I could have been in the book. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe next
Nice.
time. Maybe stories of exceptional language teachers.
Part
Maybe we
two.
do a part 2. Yes, yes. It is one of the things I wanted to ask you, Katarina, is that I think you've mentioned this somewhere in the book or maybe in this conversation that we've been having, that even these successful language learners, they also dealt with these so-called shortcomings in their second language. I think the question is, can you help us understand, I mean, if you know the answer to this, what does it mean to deal with these shortcomings in their second language? And I think you've mentioned something about linguistic limitations. I think a word that I remember reading very clearly now was the word markedness, and perhaps you could shed a light on that.
Right. So I think linguistic limitations and markedness aren't necessarily the same thing.
Right.
Markedness can be a limitation if, for some
Oh,
reason, you were
mm,
trying to blend in seamlessly with a
right.
group of people.
Yeah.
So, for example, I'm very marked in Nottingham because I have a very American accent, and so
Exactly. I was gonna say
everywhere
that.
I
Like,
go, yeah, and so everywhere I go, people ask, "Oh, where are you from? Where are you from?" And so,
and are you offended by that?
well, it's interesting because so growing up in Texas, kind of how I started, people always used to ask, where are you from? Where are you from? And that was always because of my appearance, or sometimes because of my name, but mostly it was because of my appearance.
Right.
And sometimes there's a bit of both because I have a very white name and I don't look white. And so then moving here and people asking, where are you from? And they meant it the language wise
Yeah.
was just so, because, you know, then you respond, oh yeah, my mom's Indian, my dad's Greek. And they're like, no, but like, where's your accent from? Which I just find, I feel like I should just give up, you know. It's fine. There's nowhere that I can live where people will just accept me as someone who exists.
Right.
And so I very much kind of relate with that idea of
Hmm.
wanting to not be marked. Then on the other hand, so linguistic limitations would be, you know, maybe not necessarily feeling like you can express yourself perfectly authentically all the time.
Mm.
Um, you know, or, you know, that work email that you were trying
Mm.
to write, which, you know, you might have trouble in your first language as well, but maybe it adds an extra layer of difficulty because it's also your second or third or fourth language. Yeah.
So in passing this, or in the word, passing the test, the duck test,
Yeah.
I guess, or so to speak, markedness is either, sounds like it's, you have it or you don't, it's not something that you can, it's in your control. Proficiency though is. So is this something that, and it sounds like it's passing the test is in the hands of the receiver, right? We talk a lot about with pronunciation teaching about it's a two-way street. Sure, we can work on our own pronunciation, but it's also on the person to whom I'm speaking to meet me halfway, or meet the learner or the student or whoever halfway. Am I understanding correctly that the interaction with the native-like person determines the passing of the test?
Yes. So I think so. Sorry, this is a bit confusing question.
Sorry.
Yeah,
How I
but
talk
no,
to
you're right.
somebody, I ask a question,
the
and their response to my question would indicate whether or not I pass the test.
Yeah, so we basically I think these kinds of notions of nativeness in general and native likeness, and I think a lot of people do write about this, also have a lot of intersections with, for example, race, right? Because we have this idea that certain languages align with certain races and things, and so your chances of passing for a language for which you don't look the part are a lot lower. And we do have some participants who talk about this as well. So, for example, I think Joy, I think she grew up in Brazil. So she's Canadian, and she's blonde with blue eyes. And she grew up in Brazil, and she talks about how when she was a child, even though and this was during her critical period hypothesis, so not her native like language, but as a child, she was learning Portuguese, and she sounded like a Portuguese person, but there would be like a disconnect when she spoke with people because she didn't look the part.
Yes.
But then later, as an adult, she moved to Iceland and learned Icelandic. And because she looked the part, she found it was she got a lot more leeway.
Wow.
There,
Interesting.
right?
Yes.
I identify with that. I mean, I speak Spanish, and I'm the last person who looks like I had that
Guatemala
experience all the time where I would sit down. Wherever I used to live in Costa Rica, so you'd go to a restaurant or a bar or something, and you'd just start talking, and the person's face is like, I understand you. I had this conversation 100 times. They would be like, very politely, I understand you perfectly, but what's coming out of your mouth doesn't make sense. It doesn't match with the profile of person that I'm looking at, and it's a very interesting concept for sure.
I am reminded of that episode with Dr. Jane Seta, Andrew, where she basically talks about a very similar story, Katarina. I don't know if you know who Jane Seta is. She is where is she, Andrew? I can't remember. I have to pull up
She's
the
in
information.
England as well.
She's in the UK, but I think University of Reading. I don't remember. Anyway.
Yes, that's right.
Is it Reading? Right. I don't know. I have to pull out the information here. But she talked a lot about in our episode with her when we talked about pronunciation. She said that her father really tried to kind of push her to change her accent, because I think she came from a working class family in the UK, and her father had to change his accent, and she had to change her accent in order to be able to fit in, because otherwise she would have never been able, or he would have never been able to work at a bank. I don't remember exactly what it was.
Something like
that.
I
think it's a lot. And again, she's still a native speaker who still has to pass, right? This is amazing.
Actually, I think now that you mentioned this, I definitely listened to this podcast. So yeah, no, I mean, and that's interesting, right? Because we have this idea of when a language learner wants to sound native-like, it's because they have this idea in their head of they want to just exist in spaces where people have grown up speaking that language without being marked, right? But what we don't take into account is that we also have these experiences in our first language as well. But I also think, earlier, Andrew, you said that markedness may not necessarily be something that we can change, but proficiency is. I will kind of throw that back at you. And is markedness something that we can't change, right? I think to an extent, maybe, right? And I think a lot of the kinds of things that we see with pronunciation where we say, okay, after a certain age, people are just bad at learning pronunciation. But if we look at the history of pronunciation teaching, is it maybe also because we don't really teach pronunciation very much?
Yes.
Right? We're not giving people the opportunity to change.
Yes.
And you see this with, for example, with actors who they have voice coaches to
We
then
talked
put
about that
on
in the
accents.
episode as well. Yes.
And some people
Yes.
do really, really well with it. Some people do terribly, like Emma Watson with an American accent. Really bad. So terrible. Bless her. She tried. She really did. Really, great actress, but yeah, the American accent was very strange. But other people do really, really well. And so is the reason that we think that we can't change because we think so? Because
question.
we just don't have the training?
Yeah.
Good question. And
Yeah.
that begs, this is why our shows are 9 hours long, because we have lots of, this begs a question and this begs a question. Did any of the participants in your book or throughout any of your research, like, do you do the, I'll keep calling it the test because I don't know another way to say it, but do you do the test on the phone or in a way where the person's physical appearance is hidden? And in that case, if it's just auditory, do the results change?
So we didn't do the test. So
Okay.
this is them having the experience throughout their lives. And some of them were no longer native like by the time we spoke with them because of attrition and various things. So actually, Christopher, I think, had an experience. Oh no, Carrie, sorry. Carrie had an experience where she was speaking with someone on the phone, and she was speaking Italian with them. She's a L1 English speaker, and she was speaking Italian with this woman. And then she came in the next day and was like, "Oh, hello, I was speaking with Carrie. Where's Carrie?" And Carrie's like, "Oh, yes, I'm Carrie." And the woman genuinely goes, "You can't be Carrie." The Carrie that I was speaking to was an Italian woman.
All right.
That's too funny.
The audacity.
How dare you?
Yeah, so it does happen where it is over the phone. Obviously, Carrie had different other examples of when she passed that weren't just only over the phone, but it does happen. There was another example with Christopher, who was at a hotel in Japan. So Christopher is Canadian L1 English speaker, and he learned Japanese. And he's at a hotel, and the manager of the hotel was this really elderly old woman who didn't have her glasses on. And so they had like a whole conversations and everything. And then the next morning, the woman had put her glasses on. And she goes to like the other people working at the hotel, like, "Oh my God, like there's this foreigner here. Where did he come from?" So yeah, it does happen. But yeah, it shows us also that while there are many things that we can change in terms of markedness and in terms of proficiency and pronunciation and all these things, yes, you're right. It is also in the ears of and the eyes of our beholders. So, just to cut ourselves a little bit of slack in terms of, okay,
sure.
well, no one's going to ever take me as a native speaker of Japanese. Except over the phone.
Maybe. I mean, maybe not. I mean, the first impression is just, but I'm assuming they had the same story as me. Like after you get past the first 10 seconds of like, oh my God, it's like, and then they're just talking to somebody and it's fine. And then after that, I never had a problem with, oh, you speak Spanish really well. Obviously you're not perfect and I'm not, trust me.
Yeah.
But we had conversations about, and we're just talking as two people. The first 10 seconds were like, wow, this is like not what I expected, or I haven't met too many people like this. But after that, it's like, okay, well then let's go. Let's have a conversation. Let's do the thing that we're here to do.
I'm curious because you guys were talking about all of this, but I'm very curious as to, and I think you mentioned this in one chapter in the book where you talk about phonological abilities as being a very important component of sounding or having this capacity to sound native like. And I think you described that as these learners having what I think you describe as a good ear for languages. How many of these exceptional language learners actually had a good ear for languages? And how many of them were actually able to reach this, perhaps the pinnacle, the NBA, as we've been using it here in this conversation? Were they actually capable of, or did they develop this good ear for languages, or was that something that they just didn't really achieve?
Well, I think it's interesting because when we talk about native likeness, we think about what kinds of different competencies we need to have in order to pass, right? And while I don't want to only ever focus on pronunciation, because there's so many other different competencies that are so vital for this interaction to work, pronunciation does seem to be that limiting factor, one of the biggest limiting factors. And so I would say all of our participants did have to have at least NBA level, maybe not Michael Jordan level, but at least NBA level to even pass for the first point. Because you can have someone who is speaking perfectly coherently using lots of formulaic language, no grammatical divergences, nothing.
Right.
But if their pronunciation is even slightly off on the T's or the R's, they'll be caught up. They'll be caught out, right? Someone will notice. I use air quotes here, like caught out. Yeah, like who's gonna do that? But people do, right? Sometimes when you're talking with someone and they're listening, and you can see their face go a little bit funny.
Yes.
And then they're like, finally, when you do make that T or that R, they're like, so where are you from? Because you sound a little bit off, but they can't place you. So pronunciation is one of those things where you do have to be kind of ironclad there for that passing instance to ever happen.
So it does have some sort of perhaps special status in when it comes to, sounding native like, perhaps, right? And you mentioned also musical ability. I would love to hear you talk more about that, because I feel like a lot of my experience with learning a language was connected to, so that chapter when I was reading the book and you were talking about how closely I think musical ability and language learning skills, how they are so connected. I feel like this is something that really resonated with me when I was reading, because a big part of my language learning experience was through music. So perhaps you could talk more about that.
So I think this is an area where we need a lot more future research, because first of all, we question what is a good ear, right? What kinds of both kind of passive, like listening ability, and also production ability does counts towards language learning. And then also, the question of musical ability and aptitude is also as complicated as the question of language learning aptitude. So what kinds of abilities are in there, and where do these cross over? And there are several there's quite a bit of research already about this, all with kind of mixed responses over what parts of musical aptitude are important and where these are interlinked. But I think what was interesting for us was just how many people did have musical background or musical training, or simply like a lot of their learning experience was related to music. So yeah, I think I'm really looking forward to seeing kind of hopefully what comes out of that, and if we do get more research, or maybe I'll do it.
Perhaps stories from exceptional musicians who have learned a language to a near native like proficiency. And I would love to hear you talk more about, I guess we don't have time because we want people to read the book. And to those of you who are listening, who are watching this, we're going to have in the show notes, you will have a chance to get, I think, a discount for both books, right, Andrew? We're going to leave the the discount codes there so people can
Yep,
actually
for sure, for sure.
purchase. I didn't read the whole thing. I was talking to Katarina earlier. I only read like the first 6-7 chapters, and she did tell me that their favorite chapter is not one of those first 7, so I'm gonna have to go back and continue my reading. But
hopefully the first 6 chapters are still good though.
they were enjoyable. They were very enjoyable. I'm trying to summarize all the information from the first 6 chapters into a question. But I think the question I have is, what do these exceptional language learners have in common when it comes to language learning? If you could maybe give us a few pointers here, like what were some of the things that we talked about musical ability, right? They have this background in music, but what are other things that they shared after you went through? I mean, there are 30 of them. There's got to be some stuff that they have in common here.
Yeah, they were all human.
Okay, that's a good start.
Spoke at least 2
They were
languages.
not AI, yes.
No, actually, it's interesting because that was a question that we kind of asked ourselves as well, because of course there has to be something, right? And in our conclusion, one of the first takeaways, the biggest kind of overarching lessons, is that there was no silver bullet for every single thing that we thought, oh, surely this must be the thing that they all had. For every single one, there was at least one exception, but usually at least 2 or 3.
Interesting.
And so, I think putting together the table of contents for the first book for lessons was really difficult was really easy because you have all these themes that emerged, right? But then for every single one of those chapters, there was an exception, right? Which we cover. And so there is basically, I think there are a lot of different, I think the way that we kind of put it is that there's a highway for language learning, right? And every one of these participants got onto that highway. But there are different routes onto the highway that you can take. Nice. And they shared the road at different stretches, and maybe those stretches magically were at different parts of the journey for each of them. And so it isn't necessarily that everyone has to be perfect in every single one of these factors, but rather that you need this optimal combination of them that puts you onto that highway.
Would you describe them all as motivated?
Good question, Andrew. I was about to ask the same thing.
I'm trying to think of if there was someone who I would count as unmotivated.
Okay.
They're motivated, but in different ways. So, for example, I would say the vast majority were highly motivated. They really liked language learning. They developed this very unique close bond with their language, and that was really important for them, and perhaps reigned over all of their energies for long periods of their lives. But then there were participants like Rianne, who she was very motivated, but she actually just didn't really care about language. One of the things that she says was, in school, she was terrible at language learning. And it was like one of her worst marks. Right. And then the reason that she ended up learning, I think it was German, was because she needed to for her job. She had moved to, I think it was Germany or maybe Austria, but I think Germany. And they said, okay, right, well, you're teaching classes in German next year, so get on it. And she had like decent proficiency at that point, but was like, okay, I really have to do this. So she was motivated, but maybe not in the ways we would like our students to be motivated.
Motivation manifests itself in different ways, right? It's different. It's like the routes and different roads, but kind of going to the same place. Not to extend the NBA analogy, but I'm going to because I think it's interesting. I just Googled it because I knew Kobe Bryant was famous for how many practice shots he did every day. Care to take a guess on in the off season every day how many practice shots he took?
I'd say 1,000 at least.
More
than that.
Oh my God.
2,000. In the
Wow.
off season, he'd spend every year in the off season 2,000 practice shots every single day. So I guess that's, we put him on that Mount Rushmore, I suppose. Add him with Jordan and LeBron because it's Kobe.
Hmm.
But that's how he manifested his motivation, or one of the ways, I guess, right? But others maybe don't need to take 2,000 shots a day to be good. But I guess I don't have a question here. I'm just kind of talking off the top of my head. But with motivation, there's I think we like to distinguish having a goal with
Hmm.
being motivated to achieve it, right? The goal would be to get in the NBA, let's say, and being motivated in Kobe's case is I'm going to practice 2,000 shots every day to make sure that I give myself the best shot to do it. So and I know lots of teachers who are listening, and our audience is full of teachers who have students who may fit this description of just have no access to the language, are motivated to move forward, and just kind of lack the how to take those 2,000 shots or how to get on the right road. So I think this book is really good and motivational for those teachers and for their students, that you don't have to come from a background where, let's call it privileged, where
Yeah.
you were exposed to language, that you were able to live abroad, you were able to travel, and those things are great. But if that's not you, it's okay. You can still do it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think Uwe there is the perfect example because he grew up in back then East Germany. So he had very little exposure to English. There was he could connect to like the British Foreign Broadcasting Service, and simply by listening to that excessively,
Hmm.
you know, passionately, he somehow managed to get that native like proficiency, spoken
Hmm.
proficiency at that point. But then I think another kind of takeaway I would like teachers listening to get is something from Hannah's story. So Hannah is Finnish and she learned native like L2 English. And she actually counts herself as a very bad language learner. Specifically, I think a bad student. Um,
Okay.
to the point where in one of her courses, her teacher told her that she was probably one of the worst students that he had had, um, because she just didn't apply herself. Um, and yet she was actually like a very motivated person to learn English because English was important for her because it meant that she could talk to her friends that who also
Hmm.
spoke English, or that she could watch the shows that she wanted to watch or read the books that she wanted to read. But when she rolled up to class, maybe she wouldn't do those assignments because they weren't necessarily they
I can
they weren't
totally
what
relate to her.
drives her.
I can
Yep.
totally relate to Hannah. That's exactly what I was like. You were saying that, I was like, oh my God, this is me. I am Hannah. I had this unique, because you were describing in the book the unique bond with the language. I just loved playing music. I loved having conversations with people. But my grades in English class, or my English classes, it was awful. And my mom kept saying, like, you speak the language. How can you not get like A's in English? I'm like, I don't know. I just don't apply myself in class. My teacher said I suck. I'm terrible at it. But at the same time, this I had this passion. I fell in love with English. I loved reading. I remember my first book in English. I remember reading Mary Shelley as a kid. And it's interesting because I find that, and I think you mentioned that one of the most important, I think, um, perhaps features amongst all the participants, as you said, is they all found a way to form this bond with their chosen language. And this bond can vary, right, in many different ways. And I remember it could be contact with a community, it could be culture. I was deeply attracted to English culture, to North American culture. I grew up watching Seinfeld. I grew up watching, all these American shows and this is why it was really hard for me to fit into my L1 community, because I just didn't see myself in that specific group of people. So a lot of we didn't talk about this, but I wanted to ask you this question. Identity. We didn't talk about identity. And I think maybe this is chapter 11, right? Where you talk about
um,
confidence, comfort. ownership. Maybe we can wrap things up by talking about chapter 11, apparently.
Yeah, chapter 11 and 12. So confidence, comfort, and ownership, and then identity comes after that. So this kind of idea of native likeness, what is kind of the benefit of being native like, or what benefits maybe come along with it. And so we kind of found that this arranged itself around three sort of topics. And so we called them confidence, comfort, and ownership. And so one is confidence in terms of, which is, as what's written on the book, right? On the page, it's the idea that you can have the confidence to go about your everyday life or in whatever situation and just go through it without having to worry, oh, am I going to be able to do this well, right?
Right.
But then there's also the sense of comfort that came to a lot of our participants. So this idea, I think Uwe put it really beautifully, where he said, I wish I'd written this down so I could say it, but where he said something along the lines of his English ability was something that propped him up in high stress situations. So he would be giving a lecture to, say, 100 people. And rather than just being, okay, I'm confident that I can give this lecture to 100 people, he instead said something along the lines of, actually, the English was something that he felt he could rely on, something that also allowed him to kind of take a step back and sort of use that English ability to create space where he could, I guess, communicate his authentic voice. And then the last one of those is ownership, which is this idea that the language is yours to command but also to play with. And so this comes through most easily with things like humor and jokes, because sometimes we make plays on words. And if someone knows that you are an L2 speaker, they'll correct you without realizing that, no, you were actually just making a joke.
Yes.
Which is so frustrating.
It is frustrating. It really is. Trust me.
Yeah. So that's like on a very basic level. But then there's also this kind of taking that unique bond that you create to a whole nother level where the language is kind of part of you, but also you are part of it. And I think Dani talks about this in her chapter really, really nicely about how coming to native likeness in German for her was also kind of coming to learn what German meant to her, and have access to the breadth of German literature, culture, and things like that. So those were the kind of the three things that we surprised us, I guess, a little bit with native likeness, because we spent the rest of the book talking about, well, how did they get there? But what does there mean? What happens once you're there? And these three things apparently came out of it. Yeah.
Wow. Yes. Oof.
Amazing.
There's so much there. Stories from exceptional language learners who have achieved native-like proficiency. This book, co-authored by, I don't know how to pronounce your last name, so if I butcher it, please correct me. Katarina Mentzelopoulos.
Perfect.
Good. And you also, you're a co-author. We have to talk about it. Zoltán Dörnyei. I have to admit, and I was talking to Katarina earlier in the show, before we actually started recording, I had Zoltán on my list of guests for the podcast, and it came to me as a shock when I heard of his passing. But I just wanted to kind of make this episode some sort of a tribute or pay honor to his contributions to second language education in general, to the field of psycholinguistics, because as we all know, he was a force to be reckoned with. I've never seen anyone publish so much. And I always often wondered, how does he find the time to teach and to write and to present? How? So I think the question I have for you, Katarina, is what was it like to write and to work with Zoltán, since you are also at the University of Nottingham, where he has been for a while now, or was for a while?
Yeah, I think you put it very well. With a force to be reckoned with. No, he's the thing with Zoltán is that I mean, he spent most of his career talking about motivation, right?
Hmm.
But the man himself was actually just a very motivational person.
Exactly.
Um, I would go into a meeting thinking, we're not going to make any of our deadlines. This isn't, we're so behind. I think it was the summer and the manuscript was due in October or something like that. And it was early summer, and I thought we're supposed to write two books, and we have like 60,000 words of the second book of stories, but we don't have basically anything of lessons. I've never written a book before. I don't know how long this takes, but it seems to me like it should take longer than a few months. I go into this meeting and he goes, "Oh yeah, so we can just write a chapter in a couple of days and then we can move on to the next one." And I was like, I'm sorry, did he just say to write a chapter in 2 days? Because not that's not but somehow he persuades you. He's like, "No, this is gonna be great. We've got it all here and we're doing fine and this is wonderful." And then you do it and you're like, "Oh, okay. That's I guess we did do it somehow." Which I would recommend anyone out there who's thinking of writing a book, please do give yourselves longer to write things. But also, if you can, find a really, really motivational and positive co-author. And I think the thing with this project that I was really lucky about was that it was almost like a pet project for him.
Mm.
Because it rose sort of out of the pandemic. We were all in this very strange, like liminal space of what kind of happens when you're at home for all this time. And I think for someone like Zoltán, who was so productive, I think he was probably sitting there like, okay, great, I have all this time to write, but let's do something fun. And so he just brought so much of this energy to the project because he was so excited about it. And I mean, even in some of his last emails to me, he said that this project was like one of the most exciting ones that he had worked on, and that he was just really happy to bring it to fruition. Because I think at the end of the day, I think the idea of like native like standards has been used negatively for a lot of people in a lot of different situations. But I think the thing that he wanted to bring back to the table was that, okay, yeah, we shouldn't expect everyone to climb Mount Everest, right? Like, it's just
Hmm.
unsustainable. And why would you want to? But also, there's something really valuable and interesting about people who have climbed Mount Everest, about NBA players, about Michael Jordan, that is fascinating and motivational, and we can learn from
Hmm.
them, right? And I think that's kind of what he wanted to bring to this project.
Wow.
Well, he did it because it's great,
It
and
is.
and you are too. And the books, like they're fantastic, and everyone should to grab a copy. There's two of them, right? So
Yeah.
stories of exceptional learners, and then lessons from exceptional learners. And both links are below, and there's a discount there for people as well. So thank you for and to Zoltán and the team for offering that as well.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Multilingual matters. Yes. Thanks to them for this. One last question. I think it's a good way for us to wrap this up by asking a question that I like asking people every time they come on the podcast. Sandra, I think you know which one it is.
Yeah.
It's
I'm
so
afraid.
so Katarina, if you no, don't be. It's a very simple question. If you could have a gigantic billboard, okay, with any message written on it, anything, this message is going to be spread out to the world. What would you have on it? Could be anything. Could be
Like
language learning
not
related.
necessarily
Doesn't
related
have to
to
be
language
no,
learning or
no. It
everything.
could be anything. It could be anything. Yeah.
I think be kind to yourself and to others, but also to yourself. Yeah, because I think, that from that kindness stem so many different things, right? Like we build so many wonderful relationships with people. We create these meaningful connections. We make these unique bonds with languages, and nothing ever good came out of not being kind, right? Especially to yourself and to other people, right? And so if we come from a place of kindness, then hopefully we can build something better.
Beautiful.
Sorry, it's probably very generic.
It's a great message. I think it's a great message.
I do believe it very strongly.
I do too. We all do.
Love it.
And I think we're going to be, this is going to be a great episode. I hope everyone who was listening, watching this, really enjoyed. Don't forget to get yourself a copy of Stories from Exceptional Language Learners Who Have Achieved Native-like Proficiency, and also lessons from exceptional language learners. So I think the difference is that Stories is mostly for teachers, language learners, people who are more interested in
the stories themselves.
So
Stories is the compilation of each of the stories. So there's 30 sections for each of the 30 learners that kind of goes through each of their individual stories. And then Lessons is more of kind of takes a step back and looks at the bigger picture of, okay, what were the different topics that emerged from the interviews with everyone. So that might be catered towards more researchers, but also teachers.
Yeah. Katarina, thank you very, very much for your time, for your kindness to agree to join us on this podcast. We thoroughly enjoyed the experience, and we hope you did too.
Thank you both so much. It's been so lovely to speak with you this evening, morning, afternoon.
Whatever time zone we're all in, yes.